Shane Kilkelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we're back again with the Cybernetic Brain by Andrew Pickering. And in this episode we're going to be talking through another two chapters, specifically Chapter 6, which covers the career of Stafford Beer, and Chapter 8, which closes out the book and is titled Sketches of Another Future. This beer chapter is enormous. It's like 120 pages, but it is.
Yeah, it is actually a book in itself.
Yeah, this could be like a little like zero books like thing. You know, it's like. In fact, I have books on my nightstand that are of approximately the same order of thing. But this is just a chapter in this monstrous fucking monolith of a book. Really good though. You know,
very, very, very good. Absolutely. And as I was sort of saying earlier, it's good for us as a show, I think, to do this kind of overview book of cybernetics, because as much as we, identify as cybernetic Marxists, we haven't really addressed cybernetics specifically onto the show until this point. So even though it's a huge tome, and it's a really good read, and I think it's topical.
Yeah, definitely. And like it's only taken us by now probably 19 episodes to finally get back to this.
Yeah,
it's not the worst. Not the worst sort of thing. But yeah, so like this guy Stafford Beer, I mean, whew, what a man, what a career.
Yeah, Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Just very original. Travel the world. Just a constant flurry of activity and publication, many accomplishments. A real eccentric, very interesting person. The Wizard
Prang, yeah.
Yes.
That's his fucking alter ego, which we'll get to.
his OC is Wizard Prang.
His fucking self-insert fanfic.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, boy.
But, yeah, just like a truly, truly incredible man. But he's one of the bigger figures in cybernetics, basically, especially of the second generation.
Because he was not only a guy who wrote a lot, but he was also the main sort of person who facilitated bringing people together, other cyberneticians, especially in the UK.
He was friends with everyone, yeah. But yeah, so like he sort of gets his start in like he's an Englishman. He was born in 1926, and he sort of gets his start in the beginnings of cybernetics with when he was in the British military. He got into kind of operational research, which is a kind of a discipline for like the kind of scientific planning of military endeavors, which at that time was in stark contrast to the usual way of doing things, which was some syphilitic weirdo in the position of commander, like just fucking stuck his finger in the air and decided, yeah, fuck it, let's do that.
And I mean, the operations research is important to sort of history of cybernetics, not only because it was where Beer got his start, but also because it was really where Wiener also got his start.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Like it was OR got imported from the UK into the US and then sort of blew up within the Pentagon, and that was like the origin of American cybernetics. So it goes both to Beer, but also over to the U.S. and that whole story over there.
Right. So it is the proper genesis point of cybernetics. Yeah, that's cool. But yeah, so like Beer gets into this and he starts to kind of use like he starts like messing around with like using symbolic logic to organize personnel deployments, this sort of stuff. And then afterwards in his civilian life, he kind of wrote papers on like novel statistical techniques for measuring productivity in manufacturing. And the common thread here is that he's got this like extremely practical bend, right? Like he's concerned only with like the practical impact of these kind of operations.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because at the same time that he's doing this practical work, he's in the British Army in India, right? He chose to go to India. As far as I understand, he chose to take that assignment, and while he was doing all this development of OR work, he was also doing a bunch of like spiritual work in India, and sort of like developing his beginnings as a wizard, so to speak.
Yeah. So for Beer, spirituality is a massive component of his life, including like his cybernetic work or just everything about his life. It doesn't come across initially in his writing. He keeps that strictly like behind the scenes until like the mid-70s, where he sort of like opens up much more about that sort of stuff.
Yes, yeah. That's right. So it doesn't show up in the OR stuff. You know, as you said, it's very, very practical. But at this time, he is also doing all of this spiritual stuff in India. And like, there's this account of like his family members saying when he came back, he was sort of like a completely different person.
Right. And like, but like, so like, he doesn't speak about this publicly or in his writing, but in retrospect, it's actually very, very clear that the spirituality was a gigantic well of inspiration for his cybernetic work. Like it makes a lot of sense once you tie up the threads later. But yeah, kind of diving into his like system and his sort of way of thinking, we kind of start out with his kind of classification of systems, which we covered briefly in the previous episode, but we'll restate here, that he kind of like broke various systems down into like categories of like simple, complex, and exceedingly complex. But then also kind of in terms of like deterministic and probabilistic systems. And the real sort of takeaway here is that like the latter kind of like exceedingly complex and probabilistic systems are the most sort of novel systems in the world and the most interesting, but they're also systems that are absolutely impervious to, you know, like representation and the kind of techniques of modern science. And so they demand a completely new way of approach, which is basically cybernetics, right? Like the reason you need cybernetics is to actually deal with these kinds of systems, including like the economy, the brain, the firm, political systems or social systems or whatever. You know, all the cool stuff in the world is actually like these kinds of exceedingly complex systems.
Right. Yeah. Yes. It's a view that, you know, suggests that there are areas of life and of the world where representation can be valuable, but generally speaking, we're much more concerned with these performances. That's an adaptation and viability. These are things that we can use to relate to exceedingly complex systems. Yeah.
And the reason that's necessary is because these systems are effectively unknowable. Like that they're so complex that you can't represent them. Like to try and break them down into like knowledge that you can store away is just a fool's errand, because it's like they're so complex you can't even do that. But even if you could, by the time you've digitized or like, you know, computed the representation of the system has moved because it's dynamic, right? Like, and your representation is out of date, right? Like, and you know, these systems, and that's the thing, is that they evolve in time and they behave like living things, essentially. Like they're under this constant mutation and adjustment to their environment, so that the only thing you can really do is interact with them on that performative level. Like if representation is really closed off to you as an avenue of approach, then the only thing left is to embrace the unknowability and kind of get into the performative characteristics of the systems, which I think it's like this is an immensely fascinating sort of an ontology, which we went over in the previous episode. And of course, like for listeners that are just catching up now, you should really probably go back to the previous one and start from there.
That's the groundwork.
That is definitely the groundwork, because a lot of this isn't going to make sense otherwise. Because I mean, we get stuck in pretty quickly here with like one of Beer's earliest papers was this sort of thing about like an automatic factory, where he kind of envisioned this like total automation of production.
The so-called lights out factory, right?
Right, like it'd be a factory in which you wouldn't even bother installing light bulbs because there simply wouldn't be any humans present, which is fascinating in itself, right?
Yeah, and in reality, from what I understand, there are like a handful such factories in the world today, because of the use of, you know, automation, AI, that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, they are very much the exception and not the rule.
It would have definitely been the exception in 1960. You know. Like,
oh yeah, no, I mean completely. This was a prospect in the future. It's. So one of his criticisms of the Lights Out factory, though, as the sort of concept generally stood, was that you could set up this intricate automated process inside the factory, but if the process was not adaptive, then the factory would suffer both from sort of like unforeseen things that happen within, but also from changes in its environment, right?
Yeah, like the market would shift, and this thing would be pumping out fucking Mercedes into a huge just parking lot out the back, and it would just blindly continue doing that regardless of what the environment had changed to. So this introduces the notion of adaptivity, that you need this adaptive brain essentially to allow this giant machine to adjust to its environment. And he goes into this this kind of model for this kind of factory, including this adaptive brain component. And he sort of, and I can't figure out what these letters actually stand for, but it's like a TUV system. Where, have you any idea what the fuck that's about? Why TU and V?
I actually don't know. I think there was one thing that suggested to me what the T might have meant, but it's I don't know.
I'm gonna
maybe this is from later. A different discipline that we're just not familiar with.
Okay,
that's common notation. I don't really know, but essentially the T machine is like the sensory organs of the factory, right? Like it takes in it checks the environment of the factory and also its internal state, and it has models to represent what those things are and what they mean, right? So there is representation at that level that is functioning, and there's multiple variables that are coming in. And then the V machine is like the motor organ of the factory. It enacts production actions on the basis of the T machine output. Yeah, but the really important one is the U machine, right?
Mm-hmm. Which is the sort of adaptive component, which would it's the sort of, because the T and V machines are kind of like, they're kind of almost mirrors of each other, and I think he describes the V machine as being essentially the T outputs run in reverse, and it's sort of like that's the thing, and that's all, but like that's direct coupling, and that's fine, and it's like a sort of a finite sort of system. But the adaptability comes from this U component, which would, I think in his words, like continually reconfigure itself in search of a stable and mutually satisfactory relationship between the firm and its environment.
Yes, and between the T and the V, right?
Right, it's in the middle of them.
Mediating. Yeah. And this is like this concept he uses of mutual or reciprocal vetoing.
I couldn't quite figure out exactly how the vetoing system worked. Do you have a sense of that?
So I think it is like that. There are representations within both the T machine and the V machine, right? And they are going to send information back and forth to each other by means of the U machine. And if so for example, if the T machine makes a assessment of the situation which is not in accordance with what the V machine actually experiences, then it can veto the T machine, and then the T machine will actually refine its model on the basis of the feedback from the V machine, right? So they can or like, if the V machine is producing too much stuff, the T machine can veto that, right? So there is a sort of a negotiation between the two of them of this mutual reciprocal vetoing.
Which is that makes sense, and it's an idea that comes up again and again, essentially in sort of Beer's modeling of these kind of systems, basically throughout his whole career.
Yeah, because one thing that Beer experienced with the T machine which is a thing he actually had a prototype of, was that it was very difficult. You had a lot of analytical difficulties with making sure that the T machine was getting good data. And one way that he dealt with that was with continual self-error correcting. So if the data that was coming in proved to be out of line, that would feed back into the T machine, and then its model would get adjusted in order to be closer to what it was looking for.
Yeah, that's really cool, because like these are pretty novel techniques, right, in the 1960s. This is like really this kind of like cybernetic feedback in action, right?
Yes.
And like he did actually put it into action in a particular, was it a steel plant or something, where they had
yes, I think that's correct,
right, where they kind of essentially established kind of like, they did the T and V components almost, where they had like these sensations that were modeling the kind of the T machine and like feeding into functions, which would pass back into the kind of the outputs of the thing. The U machine eluded them though, because like the computers fucking sucked in the 60s, right? Like they were dreadful things. So the U machine was simulated essentially by human management.
And what the U machine would do in balancing those two sides of the sensory and the motor, in the case of a factory, was mainly to optimize their functioning so that they could optimize for profitability. But in the abstract, this could be any number of criteria. It's just in the case of the factory, it was sort of conceived of as, or at least in Pickering's writing, it's conceived of as the profit criterion is what's used to balance these things.
Yeah, it's the most obvious example for the factory, and but like in theory, this, and again, sort of like cybernetics is supposed to be this sort of general theory. This kind of system could be set up for basically anything, and you could like have the U machine seek some sort of goal, or like in almost any defined terms, right? Like this, it's not just a technology for optimizing production within factories, right? Like this is for enabling adaptation in any system whose complexity resembles that of a factory.
Yeah, this was just the context of Beer's work, and Beer is often concerned with the viability of systems, and in a capitalist economy, the criterion of viability is, of course, profitability, right? So it makes complete sense that the managers of the plant, as the stand-in U machine, would optimize for profitability wherever they could.
Yeah. But that stand-in U machine was still kind of bothersome, right? Like that, there was still no sort of horizon for actually implementing a true sort of U machine, which leads Beer onto this like experiment in biological computing, which is like, real fun and very strange. So the key insight here is that like, if you need an adaptive brain to be this U machine, well, it has to be one of these exceedingly complex systems, and like the world's already fucking full of these things in nature and biological systems. So wouldn't it be cool if you could like commandeer one of these biological systems and make it do that job?
Yes. Yeah. The actual word that Pickering uses is enrollment.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
So he's enrolling. It's really, really interesting what's happening here, that he's trying to enroll like already smart and adaptable materials instead of creating smart and adaptable materials from nothing.
Yeah, and it's just such a brilliant idea, so bizarre and interesting, and like, aside from my normal job, I also work as a game designer and like of tabletop role playing games, and just this idea of enrollment and enrolling things into the performance is it just really gets your imagination going. It's like, well, what am I like? What if I like what if I got like a cat involved in the game or something? Like, you know, what kind of things out there in the world could I use to do interesting stuff, right? Like it's just very, very interesting.
I can think of one sort of fairly mundane example, but I think it basically illustrates the point, though, that like if you're on a Linux box and you're generating GPG keys and there's not sufficient entropy in the system, the program will tell you to wiggle the mouse and to generate entropy. And it's because like it's enrolling you, like the person sitting in front of the computer who is like you are a source of entropy, right? And it's like, I don't have enough of it. How about you come in here, you come into this loop and wiggle the mouse around, and that's what enables me to generate the keys. You know, it's like that's
and to the designer of the program, the user is a black box, right?
Yes, right.
All you get out of the user is entropy, but you can rely on them to provide it.
Yeah, exactly. The user is a black box. The program has no fucking idea whether it's actually a human or a horse or a mouse sitting on top of a wristwatch where the hand of the watch is what's triggering the motion of the mouse. You know, but it doesn't matter. It's a source of entropy, and who cares, right? Like it's just the input and the output terminals that matter to it, and the performance of the actual sort of entity involved is it just happens, and that's fine because the end result is eventually met.
And you can also rely on the user to sort of understand when they need to stop, right?
Yeah,
so that's exactly. Also nice. they're not going to work themselves to death moving the mouse around. So
no, yeah, because that is an interesting it's an important point, because it's a term that comes up in the book quite often, like a sort of a reciprocal dance of agency, where both interacting systems are agents of their own and have kind of autonomy, but they are like coupled to each other in this sort of dynamic kind of way. You know, the user stops wiggling the mouse when it is evident that that action is no longer required, and this just sort of nicely tidies itself up. It is fantastic. But in the case of this biocomputing stuff, like you get these sort of experiments with like fungoids and sort of animals and like little crustaceans and stuff, and like ultimately like an entire pond ecosystem.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, wonderful. I know how, like, what should I use to maximize the profitability of this factory? I know. Let's go use the pond out back. Like, that's gonna be our computer. Like, what? Like, okay.
This is like that, it's wow. Remarkable, because it's like getting back to the previous episode with these sort of like modern and non-modern ontologies. This is the kind of stuff you simply can't arrive at from a modern perspective.
No, it's like I was saying before, like what are you gonna do? Walk up and like start talking to the frogs and tell them what to do? Like, this just doesn't work. You can't use language to do this stuff.
No. And like just the leap of imagination it required to kind of get here is remarkable. But this was all sort of experimental stuff, and it never really worked out, which is, I mean, should be evident to anyone listening, because
yeah, I mean, like the sort of like, you know, we talk a lot about the nomad form of cybernetics, right? And that was very evident here, where it was like, yes, Beer was employed by the company to do this kind of OR work, but this was very much like on his own time, with like no real sponsorship from the corporate management to undertake these strange experiments. So like he had like a weird tank in his like kitchen or something that he was just like fiddling around with on his own time. So like it's not surprising that like his research didn't yield results, because like he didn't have like a major funding agency backing his research or anything like that. It was completely that like very stereotypically English like gentleman scholar like screwing around in his backyard kind of science.
No, it is. I don't know. There's just something absolutely wonderful about this image of messing around with these ponds and trying to like. So like I think one of the problems that he ran into seems to be that like these are these systems are very hard to program. Like you can have a pond, but it's actually really hard to try to convince it to do anything that you want it to do. So that just seemed to be kind of intractable. And like, yeah, it's a dead end for now, but who knows? Maybe in the future.
Who knows? But yeah, I mean, he sort of like used things like lamps and like magnets and stuff to try to deal with the system. But there were like problems of like, say, like the iron filings he put in the pond, like polluting the water. So there was like signal interference and stuff like that. Like it was a very messy job, as you can imagine. Like, but you know, the really interesting thing here, though, I think, is that at around this time, we started to get this idea of ecology developing, as we talked about in All Washed Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And that mode of thinking was about looking at the natural world around you and conceptualizing it as a like circuit board or as a computer system, right? But what Beer did was he took that idea of a computing machine and he actually tried to instantiate it in a real ecosystem.
Well, it's a reversal, right? Like it's like
exactly.
It's a perfect inversion where
it's like, wow, like okay. And like he did a lot of research for this project too. Like he had like these big like notes and stuff that Pickering sort of describes digging through, and it wasn't like he put a lot of time and energy towards it, but unfortunately it was a failure. And Pickering kind of talks a little bit about like subsequent developments in biological computing, like that like little like weird robot that is controlled by a cockroach brain, like or no wait, there's one robot that's controlled by a slime mold, and the other one that is like a cockroach that is like perched on top of this little like car, right? And then like the cockroach's motions like make the car go different directions, which is just like so funny to me.
It's cartoonish.
It's this like cockroach cyborg car, and it just really reminds me of like a China Mieville novel or something. You know, it's really bizarre shit. Yeah,
it's pretty weird, but I think like so even for those sort of examples, they're basically kind of like student robotics sort of projects. Like it's not sort of pursued in the same way that Beer was trying to.
No, it's not like the new Google car system is going to be cockroach driven. It's like, yeah, we use machine learning and you know we hooked up these computers to the internet and like you know had aggregate driving data of like billions and billions of driving excursions, but really what we needed was just to put a cockroach in the driver's seat.
A little fucking perspex box with a cockroach inside it just on the dashboard. You can see it, which is the worst part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but like this is like it's funny, but it's also like this perfect emblem of like this ontology of performance and sort of the primacy of performance. That like Beer is enlisting these materials because they have excellent performative characteristics, and by using them directly, you can avoid going on this like detour through representation.
Yeah, like these are beings inside of the pond and the pond itself that are like literally outside language. They can't interact with representations in any meaningful sense, but they have a kind of intelligence to them nonetheless. And that's sort of the brilliance of what Beer was doing there. Yeah,
and I think it's that they're differently clever is the way he puts it. That like it's not that, because like the question arises of like why if you're talking about managing my factory, you know, to produce steel or whatever, why would I think the pond is smarter than I am? But like Beer's thing is that it's not that it's smarter than you; it's that it's differently smart. Like it is a system that is actually like already in its nature remarkably good at balancing these kinds of books, you know, and if you just let it do its thing, it'll do that very cleverly. And I mean, you can play the violin or fucking do whatever, and that's clever. But like this system here is actually fucking excellent at this task.
That gets back to that sort of idea of ontological variety, right? That it's not just like a scalar value of intelligence. There are like different sorts of things we could describe with the word intelligence out there.
There's a huge multiplicity of intelligences and sort of like consciousnesses. And there's actually a really wonderful bit here that, like, you know, that solutions to problems simply grow. Yeah, that's a really, really excellent way of...
it's a kind of like very... I don't know if I would say a profound statement, but it does really capture succinctly Beer's sort of general outlook on the world and life.
And like, so before we get into the sort of next big bit, which is the viable system model, Pickering sort of talks a bit about, like, again, the social basis for Beer's cybernetics, and like it's again the same repeated theme of like it was quite marginal. And that, like, Beer didn't really have much in the way of consistent institutional support, and instead had like a career of kind of wandering between various positions and taking on all sorts of different projects. Which is kind of, but like there are hints in here of a possible alternate history in which this would have actually had institutional support. That there was at one point the possibility of establishing a national institute for cybernetics, and you know, he tried to persuade the Labour government in the 60s to make this kind of like to take it seriously. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. But it's kind of maybe interesting to ponder what could be different about today's world if this kind of cybernetics had gotten huge institutional support and, say, government backing in the 60s. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar to like the story of Soviet cybernetics that we saw earlier, right? Like what could have been, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Can it ever be otherwise?
Yeah. Could we have ever avoided like the whole detour into Thatcher? Who knows? Yeah.
But yeah, so like the sort of, I think this is arguably sort of the meat of Beer's sort of system of thinking with the viable system model, where he published 3 books in and around 1972, which is The Brain of the Firm, The Heart of the Enterprise, and Diagnosing the Systems of Organizations. And he sort of like developed the ideas he had for the cybernetic factory a bit further. And in particular, the real innovation here is that he's focusing on information flows and structures, and particularly he's taking inspiration from nature, specifically the human nervous system. So this thing resembles a spinal column and brain, is basically it.
Yes,
right? Like,
absolutely.
Which is strange to look at in the diagrams, right? Like,
it is. It is very strange to see this very like clear analog of the human nervous system transposed into an organizational diagram, which is also like sort of written in the mode of a circuit diagram, which is, you know, that just sort of like weird overlapping nomad character of this stuff is like, well, it's not really one thing or the other. We'll maybe talk a little bit later about that sort of human body element of the VSM, but we should probably describe what the components of the VSM are.
Yeah, so like it's kind of like composed of like various sort of layers 1 through 5, where the lower layers are the kind of like sensory and motor sort of organs, like kind of analogs of the limbs and the heart and the liver and this sort of stuff. The higher layers, like layers 3 through 5, then are kind of like the upper spinal column, and the brain. Where layer 4 is the broad equivalent of the U machine from his previous endeavors, and there's this really interesting sort of property here of like there being like local autonomy within each subsystem, and then the subsystems communicate with each other by emitting signals when they deem appropriate, and there are like monitoring systems that kind of relay information and like provide corrective feedback to the subsystems, but then nothing's really issuing direct sort of commands. It's all sort of like it's all very organic the way it's explained, you know? Yeah,
like so for example, like the level 1 systems can communicate horizontally with each other as well as up the spinal column, so to speak. But then like I think it's like level 2. Doesn't it have like a sort of coordinating function similar to the like autonomic processes of the spinal column?
Yeah, something like that, where it's like it's a higher level policy that sort of monitors what's going on in level 1 and then sort of issues corrective signals when it detects things going out of whack. And then there's level 3 does the same again, but for the lower 2.
It's more, level 3 is more of like a getting the big picture and then filtering the need to know information up to level 4 and 5.
Which is how organic systems work, right? Like where the lower components, like the heart itself, just does its own thing. It only issues like signals only really leave that sort of region and go to the higher system when there's like a problem or there's something to report. And then the higher level systems can take action and so on. But like it's this really cool combination of like autonomous systems with regulation and feedback. And I think it's again achieved through this reciprocal vetoing that came up in the previous TUV machine.
Yes, it's just it is now a system comprised of people, as opposed to some kind of pond monster that you design in your backyard.
It is still like the way System 4 is or like level 4 is imagined to be the equivalent of the TUV sort of machine, and it's kind of like the way he describes the way this control room would function is quite fun, where it'd be like sort of a combination between a sort of World War II era like war room, like in a bunker beneath London somewhere, but also combined with like a smoking lounge, where like I can just imagine the management coming in, into this like wood paneled, lovely sort of 1960s sort of setting, and like picking up a sherry at the reception desk and sort of strolling in to look at the charts and stuff. It's like,
yeah. Well, actually, I think that he says in his notes that paper is forbidden in the command room. Right, like you can't have any documents to look over or like notes to write. You just look at like the diagrams that are shared amongst everybody and talk to the other planners about what's happening, because it's about the shared conversation and sort of like open-ended thinking, instead of getting into the nitty-gritty details. And I'm sure that this is a thing that he came up with based on long experience in boring committee meetings that didn't go anywhere, right?
Yeah. This would be a much more fun way to spend your workday, certainly,
right?
Or at least much more stimulating and much less dour.
And I mean, this is the thing we actually get to see later down the line in Project Cybersyn, right? Like they actually built this room. This actually did get made. So,
and it looks really cool. It's
it does. It looks really cool. Yeah,
it follows through on the promise. But the level above it, like System 5, is the kind of like equivalent to the human cortex, with like the very highest level of policy direction, which would be your kind of like board level, essentially, where like only the highest level sort of problems should be propagated up that way.
It's very like future oriented, right? Like it's about like constructing the sort of like 5-year plan kind of things.
Yeah, it's policy direction, and like they're issuing in like from that level downwards. It's issuing like instructions in only the most coarse kind of sense. It's not trying to control level 1 specifically or directly. It's kind of like issuing just policy, which makes this like a really interesting sort of system, because it's adaptive at every level, and there's this richness of like feedback between like sibling components and between them and their higher components, and between the entirety of the system and its environment, because like levels 4 and 5 are tasked with also kind of reading from the environment as well as reading from the rest of the system.
Right, and then the other idea was that it is like recursive, right? So that the lower levels contain within them levels 1 to 5 as well.
Which really, really changes the picture, right? Like it's sort of
like they are also intelligent, right? Like they are not just like dumb pipes that transmit information up the line, right? Like, which, you know, kind of squares to an extent with our understanding of human physiology now, right? That there is a certain amount of intelligent work that is done at the organ, like the sensory organ level, and not just at the brain level.
Yeah, which is like this just really is like the firm in the image of an organism. It's replicating just everything about what Beer knew about biological systems. And like there's also a bit here about goals, right? That like the entirety of the system doesn't actually set a kind of goal. It's not like a thermostat, right, where you program it with the specific goal of meeting this temperature. But this system is open-ended enough that it can just kind of like openly adapt endlessly, like to any kind of eventualities.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, something that I have designed for a lot in tabletop role-playing games, right? Like, there is no given objective that you have to achieve in the game. You set the goals as you go, right? And there is a conversation that allows you to do that goal setting. So yeah, I mean, this kind of design is very different from the kind of design of like, I'm going to build a clock. The clock is designed to tell the time. It will operate according to a regular pattern, and it will be reliable, right? This is a very, very different sort of thing.
Yeah, it seems that like this is the sort of this is the pinnacle of like Beer meeting his own objective, right? Like of trying to design this kind of a system, because like this is that thing he wanted of the completely adaptive brain, or the completely adaptive system that would just be able to behave in this way indefinitely and hopefully survive.
Right. I mean, as best it can, right? Yeah, I mean, because like he talks about the difficulties of actually implementing this system, right? Which is, you know, a thing that any consultant would run into going into an organization. But, and of course, when we talk about Project Cybersyn, you know, there were difficulties such as fascists, imperialism, like all kinds of things. But the model is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in 1970, Salvador Allende becomes president of Chile and is the first ever like democratically elected socialist president in the world, which is pretty amazing. But then in 1971, this guy Fernando Flores, who was working in the government, contacts Beer asking for help with basically the complete reorganization of the Chilean economy. And this is explicitly an invitation to implement the viable system model on a national scale.
Yeah, so Flores had become aware of the VSM from some stuff that Beer had published, and then was interested in bringing him on board.
Yeah, which is like to go from sort of doing consultancy for like various kind of, I don't know, steel mills or whatever around Brighton or wherever he was doing it, right? Like it's to go from that to like, oh, do you want to do this, but like for an entire economy? It's a pretty big leap, right?
Oh yeah.
But I mean, they pulled it off, and the thing is, like, they pulled it off fucking fast, right? Because like they needed to move really quickly, and they actually got
it's a revolutionary situation, right?
It was immensely sort of fraught and like because like you have that economy was under such enormous pressure, right? Like that, like they had to get this thing functional basically immediately, and you know, if you squint at it, they basically did, because like that was like he was contacted in July of 71. By November of 72, they had basically like a cut down version of the VSM installed and functioning.
Yeah, so from what I understand from reading Cybernetic Revolutionaries, like there were some large sections of the design spec that they weren't able to implement, but yeah, the basic sort of like diagnostic informational stuff was implemented. So that's pretty impressive, and like especially given the resources they had at their disposal, right? Like they had one computer?
Yeah, it was like a PDP-11 or something, or some shitty IBM thing, because like they couldn't import any more stuff, or they couldn't afford it anyway.
And they couldn't afford it. Like, you know, they were in a situation of massive economic upheaval, and And like as far as like the like system or like the level 1 stuff, they were just using teletypes installed in different factories and workplaces around Chile in order to do the data processing. And those things have no computational power at all. They're analog machines, right?
They're just fancy keyboards. Yeah.
They're just fancy keyboards. So like the computational work at those lower levels was being done entirely by humans. And it was only at the highest level that there was actually any digital computing going on.
Yeah, but like, and I suppose it's kind of worth pointing out that like this one and only computer was situated in Santiago with the control facility, which was this really impressive looking kind of Star Trek kind of room with like these cool chairs with like the little buttons and the armrests and the cool projector screens and stuff. Just looks really awesome.
Yeah, it looks amazing, but like it was essentially like if you look at the overall design, it was kind of built like a TV set because you have these like walls and they have like the screens on them and stuff, and then there's like the chairs in the middle that are like built in a circle so that you can have a conversation. But like when you step outside the room, you were just like in a larger room, and
right.
like the walls were just like built into the middle of the room, like basically like a TV set. And on the outside, they just had like assistants who would like read out the data that would come from when the person inside pressed the button, and they would like pick up the like transparency and like stick it on the screen. So it was like, you know, like we imagine it to be like, oh, it's like this computerized control room like you would see in some Hollywood movie or something, but really it's like you press the button and there's just like a light that lights up outside, and then like the assistant, like the intern, just like picks up the transparency and changes it. It's like, it's so like ramshackle. It's just amazing how they managed to create this incredible image of like modernity and like, you know, the cutting edge of socialist planning, right? But really it was just like, you know, extremely primitive technology that they were using. So yeah, it's very interesting.
So it's like, it's remarkable that the project kind of like, there was a shrinkage in terms of the implementation, but there didn't seem to be any shrinkage in terms of the scope of the overall project, right? Like that even faced with these like crippling problems of like just like complete lack of resources, they still went all in on the actual big picture, right? Like, and they skimped on things like computers and, you know, having a guy hold up a flash card instead of using a projector and that sort of stuff. But if you were to try and do this kind of project with that lack of resources in almost any other context, the engineers would just say no, like we don't have the money, you can't do it, you know.
Yeah, it's like because they didn't have this, they wouldn't have this notion of enrollment, right? Like that's what Beer was doing in the design, was enrolling the population of Chile in the task of computation, basically, of figuring things out. And because it was like, oh yeah, like we don't have the latest IBM mainframes that the Pentagon has, but we do have a lot of people. So
they're just as good. Yeah. But this is impressive stuff, and it's impressive to go from this like kind of functioning model of what these kind of firms or these kind of systems would look like, to then have it just be implemented at this enormous scale, and to have it work out, except for, you know, when it didn't work out because of, you know, pressure from international capital and the organization of a fucking coup, right? Like,
yeah, because of, you know, Milton fucking Friedman and his pals. This is making me think, what was it like? There was that Chapo episode, they're talking about like the Milton Friedman Foundation for the like murder and extermination of the poor or something like that.
Oh, it's a joke. They come back to this a couple of times where it's like, it's that sort of thing, and then it's like the people going off to work for the Pinochet Institute for Fiscal Reform. This sort of
right,
stuff.
Exactly. So like that's where all this shit comes from, right? Like, and yeah, I mean, so the sort of signature accomplishment of Cybersyn was in helping to adapt to this trucker strike that happened during the later stages of the Allende government. So basically the CIA and affiliated organizations pretty much appealed to like these like petty bourgeois layers of Chilean society to stage this strike in order to freeze up the Chilean economy and try to force Allende out that way before they went to actually just, sending in the military and, killing people and rounding them up and shooting them and all that kind of stuff that they did. And so what they were able to do with Cybersyn was they were able to locate points of shortage in the economy and reallocate resources as needed in order to survive the resource constraints that were being placed by the strike. So it was actually successful in that role. So it did actually overcome a major practical hurdle that the government was faced with. Which is impressive, given that they had 2 years to design the thing and like it was done on a shoestring budget, right?
I think that's just the word for this is just impressive. Like it is mightily impressive that this could be pulled off at all, and work. I would dread to be anywhere near this kind of a project just for sheer fear that it wouldn't work out. You know what I mean? Like this is ambitious.
Yeah, I mean it takes
stuff.
takes courage to stage a revolution, and it takes more courage to actually carry it out, right? Like it's a big deal. And I mean, and they failed, right? Like the revolution failed, but this project in itself could probably be seen as a success. Maybe the one sort of like major question mark that I think hangs over the project, from what I understand from reading Cybernetic Revolutionaries, is that it's possible that the Pinochet thugs collected the information that had been stored with Cybersyn and used that to help with their campaigns of disappearing people and fascist repression. So this criticism that Cybersyn was a top-down system of like sort of Stalinist domination was like completely off the mark, but the skeleton and sort of the guts of this project could be repurposed towards that end without question, right? Like, you can see in it the precursor to some wonderful system of socialist coordination in the future, or you can see in it the precursor to like PRISM or some other, NSA nightmare project.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's sort of like it definitely it leaves us sort of pondering like how to design similar systems that maybe aren't vulnerable to that kind of hijacking. Yeah, that is definitely a valid critique. Which
it's just that the actual critiques that were leveled at Beer at the time that he was working on this project were not valid, right? Because like they were criticizing his design intent and the actual spec of the project were not what Pinochet potentially did with it. Like we're not sure if that actually happened or not, but there's some suggestion it might have. So yeah, it is. But it sounds like it sounds like Beer got pretty sick of this kind of talk about this sort of like domination aspect of the VSM, because when Pickering asked him about it, he was just like, like, I am heartily sick of this matter. Like, it's like, I don't want to talk about it. Like, I've been talking about this for like 40 years and it just never lets up. Yeah.
But like, so his beer changes a bit after this point, right? Like 1973, where like his writing becomes a bit, like quite a bit more concerned with, like, so he, up until this point, he's maintained a sort of like very professional sort of face, right, in his writing. But now he's writing explicitly about liberty, democracy, and how to, that's the way he puts it, like how to enable change in a sick world, right? Like that, he's taking on an actual sort of political project, really.
Yeah, he writes this. He starts out in this Platform for Change book with the words, "Hello, I would like to talk to you, if you have the time, in a new sort of way about a new sort of world." And he ends it with, "I am fed up with hiding myself, an actual human being, behind the conventional anonymity of scholarly authorship." It's just like, fuck yes.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
On that one.
Because, we talked about this, right? That, like, there was this whole side to Stafford Beer that, he started developing when he was in India, that he hid in his professional writing. And also, his experiences of the revolution. He could have just, cram those away in a little black box somewhere dark in the corner of his mind and got on with his life. But no, he decided to speak more openly and honestly about his personal feelings, his personal thoughts, his personal experiences, and his political views.
Yeah, but those views are like really, really, I think, quite fruitful. Maybe for like our sort of project of like kind of technological socialism or whatever like that. So Beer, he sort of like, he sees like people as complex and unknowable systems, and groups of people as, even more complex, and being sort of engaged in this kind of mutual influence and reciprocal interaction, right? Like it's all about like symmetric social relations, adaptive coupling between groups, right? Like, and this is his way of achieving maximal freedom in practice, because like this kind of reciprocal coupling involves a giving up of some freedom, right? But like the point is to minimize the reduction in freedom and to put all of these systems on a kind of even footing with each other, so that like it's like there's an implication of a sort of classless society in the way he speaks, right? Like, yeah, and it's like social technology, right? Like it's kind of, he's then applying the cybernetic principles to like, well, okay, we've explored how a firm should behave, we've explored how an economy could behave under these principles, but like how should a society behave in this kind of way? There's a little bit of a diversion here then on like kind of, well, it's kind of getting on the same thing of like, well, in this kind of like society of complex interacting systems, how do you achieve like feedback, for instance, between the government and the populace? And he has this sort of idea for like a TV feedback dial, where you would have like a cool little dial on the armchair that would be like from red to green or whatever, or from smiley face to sad face, and you would turn the dial, according to your feedback on whatever's on screen, and then like. But crucially, the overall measurement of the entire population's sentiment is also visible on the screen and is visible, say, in studio for the politicians that are on screen, right? Like, so they can see sentiment in real time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, it was a meter of happiness, right? And he sort of specifically said that, like, he didn't try to describe in particular what happiness meant. Like he was specifically opposed to polling because he thought that polling kind of presupposes its responses by giving a specific wording for the question, whereas this dial was just a dial that said like happiness on it, right? Like it's just like whatever that means to you, then just express that with your dial, right? But there were problems with this technology. Like he was like, oh well, like you could have like an extremist faction that would just get their members to like basically downvote anything that they didn't like. So you see like the Steam rating system, right?
Yeah.
Right, like those like floods of downvotes that like the Gamergate shitheads end up like launching against any game that has positive depictions of women or anybody that isn't themselves. So he was aware of those kind of problems, and so he kind of scrapped this project. But it does show like sort of the ways in which he thought about feedback. And
it's like the specific kind of goal here was, well, ironically, sort of like to bring about emergent goals, right? That like the politicians in the studio don't necessarily know exactly what's being expressed by the needle floating somewhere like at the 80% mark. So they come out with something on air. They're like, I don't know, what about I don't know, taxes for dogs or something, and then the needle goes up and they're like, okay, cool, like what's and it's this like creative sort of feedback loop.
Right, because it could be they bring up some kind of unusual idea that like isn't on the sort of predetermined talking points agenda, and people respond very positively to it, right? And so then it shoots up the agenda, and it's like, oh, really? Like people like this? Okay,
people are into this stuff.
Dog taxing, all right, yeah. Let's talk about that.
We're getting into some weird places, but whatever you guys say.
Pond computers and dog taxing, okay.
Yeah. But like this is like this is starting to get into some really kind of, I think, useful stuff, because like he zooms out a bit further again to like kind of like looking at populations of these complex systems and feedback loops to the kind of like the nation state level, really. And he kind of like in the book we get this kind of observation that like nation states lack any of this kind of like symmetric relation and interaction. And also like we get this kind of really astute sort of rundown of like one of the like most pressing issues of our time, which was the tendency for crises at this kind of nation state level to spiral out of control because of like one of these like fundamental problems with the modern ontology. And the example here is basically the war on terror, right? Like that followed 9/11, which was essentially kind of like the last great failed project of modernity, right? Like an attempt to directly impose control asymmetrically on the world and to restrict its variety. And we get shown a sort of a model that Stafford Beer had for modeling crises, and he sort of sees it as being like that the crisis node is high variety. It is very complex, but that the information from the crisis is channeled through low variety channels to decision makers or to the public at large. And then decisions are made based on this very poor understanding of the crisis. Action is taken, which of course is off the mark, right? Like, and it amplifies the crisis because it's specifically because it's a failure of representation, right? Like that you end up channeling this extraordinarily complex crisis in through like channels that are essentially one bit in depth, right? Like it's us versus them, or peace versus war, or like terror versus whatever, and that's collapsing everything to a fucking 1-bit signal, right? Which is simply not enough to act on. And it's like I think this is like the great failed project of recent modernity, that like it turns out that imposing control on the world and reducing its variety is strictly impossible because of the complexity of the world. But here we are.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which we can use these representational and instrumental schemes to alter the world in powerful ways, right? Like, we can build like the modern technostructure of transportation, right? Like that is a way of repurposing the world towards a very specific end. However, the problem is that these systems are not really viable, right? In Beer's sense, that they are not really adaptive, right? Like we get weird things, like, for example, in the United States or Canada, there is a huge reliance on the automobile, and there's a huge reliance on fossil fuel. And that ends up sort of perpetuating itself in a way that is totally non-viable, right? Like the individual purchasing decisions of consumers and the overall decision-making procedures for politicians proceed according to this like ingrained instrumental logic that was built into the world with the highway system. And it's just not adaptive. So a lot of the problems that we're having right now about like these kind of like large-scale civilizational challenges can be seen as symptomatic of that sort of like non-adaptive representational problem that Beer was bringing up, as well as, of course, being symptomatic of capitalist rationality.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there are people who claim they're kind of one and the same thing, right? Like, but yeah, there's a lot of factors going on there. But like, I think I think I'm with Beer on this, that like there is something, and it's a point that Pickering brings up again and again, that like ontology matters, right? That like, but if your view of the world if your model of the world is simply incompatible with reality, which it seems is the case, right? That like, then you're doomed to failure anyway, right? Like these projects can't work because, kind of going back to that notion that like control is simply impossible, like it by definition can't succeed because the goal is impossible, right? Like, so, but we're sort of in this moment where we're definitely living in the wreckage of the sort of war on terror and these kind of failures. And this was the stuff that was the kind of downer ending for All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, right? Like the palpable like collapse of these modern narratives. And especially Curtis's subsequent series. What was that one called? Hypernormalization?
Yeah, hypernormalization, like that really gets into like the war on terror stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
But we live in this world now, right, where so we're in this sort of wreckage, and it seems like modernity just doesn't work. But and like Curtis's conclusion is basically, well, okay, downer, guess we're kind of screwed or something, or there's like a sort of a negative sort of conclusion there. Mm-hmm. But this cybernetic ontology, or this promise of a non-modern way of viewing the world, or the way of viewing the world as complex and unknowable and filled with adapting systems, does give us some kind of positive vision of what we could do now that we have the evidence in that like this modern ontology may not work. What can we do? Where can we go from here? And this is potentially an answer to it.
Yeah, and the good thing about cybernetics over, say, just like Latour's work is that these are like practical projects that people have engaged in, so it's much easier to think with them, think with these examples, than to just have like this kind of sweeping critique of the modern. It is like, okay, these are things that people have actually done. What worked, what didn't, what can we learn from these situations? That's kind of what we get out of this book.
We have further confirmation that we're on the right track here, because like the critique is representational, right? But the practice is what matters, right?
Yeah, the practice is what matters. Totally. Yes.
I think this is promising stuff, right? That like because like it's evident to everyone that like we can't go on this same trajectory, right? Like it's not actually working. So
like pretty much everyone, really.
Yeah. Even the people who won't admit it, right? Like,
yeah. It's like even the people on the right, even the reactionaries, like they also think that nothing is going right, there's a general sense of everything is fucked. So yeah.
And so like, but also there's a sort of there's a certain kind of like status quo liberal that would like sort of tell you that you'd best not, like, you are in the wreckage of the failure of modernity, but you'd best not open your eyes, because like when the Wile E. Coyote goes off the cliff, it's only when he looks down that he actually falls. That like there's definitely a contingent that are kind of like of the belief that if we just keep our eyes closed and don't consider alternatives, then this will keep working somehow. But what Pickering's doing here is he's trying to bring cybernetics and this non-modern ontology back into mainstream discourse, and trying to make it very clear that this is actually an alternative way of thinking and an alternative way of approaching the world that might be more fruitful than keeping your eyes closed or like not looking down off the cliff that you've just run off of.
Yeah, and he kind of follows Beer's advice by avoiding the conventional anonymity of scholarly authorship, right? Like, it is he inserts himself into this, as we've said before, and also writes it in such a way that it's enjoyable to read and makes you want to read it.
He's a great author, and he does the self-insert thing well, which is like a really hard trick to pull off, right? Like, he manages the change in voice is expertly pulled off. But I suppose, so like that's maybe more material that we probably should have saved for the end, but it's the war on terror thing just stands out so much in this chapter, like as like a crucial component of like why this kind of new way of thinking is actually necessary. But there is one big sort of thing to mop up before that, and it's this like other project that Beer had going on, Teams Integrity, which is essentially like a format for holding a meeting, but it has some like really interesting properties.
Yeah, it addresses some of the problems we saw in that little dial project that we saw earlier, right? Where you'd have just sort of bad actors who would take over the discussion. Integrity is kind of thoughtfully designed as a procedure. It has structure, even though it is sort of like the main inspiration for this project was Beer's observation that in meetings, sort of corporate meetings or government meetings, those kinds of official meetings, there is a bunch of irrelevant crap that gets talked about because it's placed on the agenda. And then at the end of the meeting, when it's like, oh, and is there anything else? That is the actual stuff worth talking about that gets like 5 minutes of time. So he's like, okay, what if we could, instead of pre-dictating the objectives of the meeting, instead work from those and anything else parts and build that into an agenda, right? So that was the purpose of this project, this design project that he did.
Yeah. And like the format is you take 30 people with a common interest and you get them to like come up with a set of like specific topics for discussion, and these are the statements of importance. Then you kind of get them to vote on the top 12, and then you kind of structure it like an icosahedron, which is a weird shape. Where like the thing with the icosahedron is it has 12 vertices, like 12 dots, and then 30 edges, like the lines between the dots. And so each of the vertices is a topic, and then each of the edges is a person. So each person is involved in two topics, right? Like you can kind of see it in this structure. And the group then goes about like convening and dissolving these discussion groups around the concrete topics, so that like obviously like you can be in both discussions at once, so you have to like figure out a way of alternating. But the kind of property of this is that like as these discussions take place and people flip-flop between their groups, the views and the sort of updates to these like statements of importance propagate around the structure, like around this kind of crystal lattice sort of thing. Because
people are going back and forth between the two vertices, and each vertex has five edges connected to it, you have this kind of constant propagation across the whole structure. Which is really cool, because it's like this. The thing I like about it is that it's open-ended and emergent and all that, but it's also bounded, because it's not like a runaway system. Like it's kind of like it doesn't have that property of being open-ended in the sense of like existing in a continuous space. It's like in this very confined space, but it's like structured, but it is also like there's a lot of freedom involved, and there's like I mean it's a very different kind of procedure than what we saw in like the Occupy days, right? Like where it would be just like people would raise their hand and get up and speak to everybody at once, and then people would like boost up their voice. This is like many different topics being discussed at once in parallel, but also those different parallel discussions are influencing one another. So the bandwidth is way greater than what we saw in the Occupy gatherings.
Yeah, it is. It seems really promising, and like it's also kind of not vulnerable to the kind of hijacking that the VSM could have been.
Right. Although it is also not really a decision or control system. It is just a kind of exploratory thing for kind of like understanding the democratic mood and formulating those things into coherent thoughts.
Yeah. So I think you end up then with like the end product is the various statements of importance, but they've been refined by the process, or like various conclusions falling out of the discussions from them. I think I would be really curious to see how that would actually run. Like it would be really good fun to actually do one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it really reminds me of like a tabletop RPG in the way it's sort of like structured discussion or like a LARP or something, but this is with a rather practical aim to it. So yeah, and I mean, another thing he emphasizes like that the conclusions that you may come to with the discussion, they may seem rather banal. Like this one syntegration that they did, the points they came out with were like local empowerment, the need to push decision making downwards, especially in the case of abolishing nuclear war. Point 2, law and government, the move from ownership to stewardship, control to guardianship, competition to cooperation, winners and losers to winners alone. And number 3, how to make world peace. Sovereign individuals acknowledge and accept the responsibility of a human world social contract towards environmental protection, security, and evolution of the planet. So, I mean, you know, that's all quite nice, but it is not really a program of action, right? And, you know, what he emphasized about the process was, like, it was mostly about the process. Like, what you get out at the end, like, yeah, that can be valuable, but that's not the reason why we're doing this. It's about bringing these different points of view together into dialogue with one another as sort of like a substantive process of democracy, right? It's the performance over representation thing again, right?
Definitely, yeah, and like it has such an emphasis on the democratic and the symmetric sort of relations that it is like that sort of later Stafford Beer stuff like really put into action, and sort of like the last two sections in this chapter concern cybernetics and spirituality, and then there's a little bit at the end about kind of music and like the Stafford Beer's influence on Brian Eno, which is might seem really out of left field, but does have some relevance. The spirituality bit is really interesting because like basically like Stafford Beer was an extremely spiritual individual, and like he didn't start like really talking openly about it until like much later in his career, but like it's actually quite clear that this had profound impacts on him. Even his earliest thinking, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we said, like when he went to India as part of his work with the British Army, he did pick up a lot of spiritual practices when he was there, and he sort of went through a period of going from the Church of England to the Catholic Church, becoming a Catholic, and then later left the Catholic Church and sort of just pursued his own spiritual practice, right? But more importantly, I guess you could say, is there's a couple points. One was his sort of interest and practice of Tantra, and the other was this Hylozoic view of the world as alive, that he sort of carried deeply within him.
Yeah, I find the Hylozoism is really, really interesting in that it's kind of like it sort of posits like an equivalence between like the. Like there are human limits to understanding of the world, right? And that sort of means that there's like this sort of like basic sort of mystery about like the world itself, and that the thing is that like God is the thing that explains that mystery, right? Which means that like spirit is in nature, right? Like it's not a separate thing. So we're back to the kind of monism again. This kind of unity between these two things. Well, actually, they're not two things. They're actually the same thing, right? Like it's,
Yes. Yes.
And so, like for Stafford Beer, the mysteries of the existence of God and the mysteries of like exceedingly complex systems are just the same mystery, right? Like there just isn't a difference. Like there isn't a distinction worth drawing between the two.
Yeah, I mean, this is going back to like the sort of tradition of like Spinoza and Hegel and the American pragmatists and all of those sort of groups. I mean, you can find many spiritual traditions. Like I think like Theosophy was the thing that inspired Beer a lot, and of course, outside of Europe, there were many influences on him as well. But there's a certain philosophical and spiritual tradition within sort of like the Western canon that you could definitely place Beer within there.
Yeah, there's also this really sort of nice bit about like his sort of kind of regarding nature as its own computer in a sort of weird way, that like a river is a river computer computing a river, like that all the complex interactions in the world are computed in a sense, but they are computed in themselves and in the act of performance, right? And that like the results, he sort of has a poem about like the kind of the Irish Sea, and it's like
he wrote this poem, Computers the Irish Sea, which might help to explain sort of what he was getting at. He says, that green computer sea with all its molecular logic to the system's square inch, a bigger brain than mine, writes out foamy equations from the bow across the bland blackboard water, accounting for variables which navigators cannot even list, a bigger sum than theirs, getting the answer continuously right without fail and without anguish, integrals white on green, cursively writes, recursively computes that green computer sea on a scale so shocking that all the people sit dumbfounded, throwing indigestible peel at seagulls, not uttering an equation between them. All this liquid Diophantine stuff of order umpteen million is its own analog. Take a turn around the deck and understand the mystery by which what happens writes out its explanation as it goes. So it's this very like there's a lot of sort of images of representation, but these are like this is like a performative representation that makes representation redundant, right? Like it is the performance is sufficient in itself.
Right, because like the very last line contains that like the what happens writes out its explanation as it goes. That like there isn't really a need for the representation because like definitionally whatever it is doing is the thing. I love it.
Yes, it's very very reminiscent of Spinoza to me in a way. Yeah, so this is it's very very interesting. This sort of sense of the sufficiency of reality, that it just is enough. It is so plentiful and so deep that there is no need to comprehend it in its totality because it is computing itself.
Yeah,
we're just a part of that.
It's it is really profound. I absolutely love that. Yeah, it's great, and it's performance, pure raw performance, and just matter doing its own thing. But the matter is spirit also, for Beer. So this is just the way the world is, and it's just wonderful, and you can really feel that off the poem, right? Like that.
Yeah, he was actually a good poet in addition to being a good cybernetician. He's not like Marx, No, Marx. He's good in many ways, but not the best poet out there. So
no, did Marx wrote some like shitty teen angst poetry or something?
Yeah. It was very very much teenage love poetry. Yeah. But hey, you know, his wife was convinced, so she stuck with him and all through thick and thin for the rest of their lives.
It can't all be good, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Not everyone can be Stafford Beer. But yeah, like when we get into the discussion of his sort of tantric leanings, though, we get this kind of like really fun introduction to his a book he wrote in like. It's like the Adventures of Wizard Prang, which is essentially him, and is like kind of outlining his sort of spiritual system. But like his writing here is definitely departing way off from the kind of like managerial stuff, but is still sort of basically cybernetic. It's not really something I can really speak to though, because like I think that this particular section kind of washed over me a bit because I just don't really have that much of a sort of a grounding in this sort of topic. But
yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of fundamental problem here with this stuff is that it is kind of evasive of representation, right? Like it's like a lot of the knowledge that comes out of spiritual practice of this kind, like, you know, meditation, yoga, and so on, is really just like based on testimonial or the actual practice, like the instructional practice, like the procedure for how to do it, right? Like those are the kind of two forms of transmission that we have. And like testimonial is notoriously like suspect, right? Like self testimonial about experience is like, well, how can you trust that, right? Like there is in the modern world, and even going back to like pre-modern times, there's a deep suspicion about this kind of writing or speaking, because it's so easy to be a charlatan and to pass yourself off as something that you aren't when the only source of evidence is your own words, right?
Yeah. And like, I suppose even we're talking about something that like takes years or whatever, a lifetime of kind of deep study or whatever, and basically by definition only the practitioners really get it. So outsiders are like at a disadvantage already. You know, like,
and it's like it's difficult to reproduce even for someone who has a fairly high level of mastery.
Yeah.
Right? And so that means that it is very difficult to test. And if it can't be tested, and if there is no third-party testimony about what happened, then it's sort of like our modern structures of knowledge are going to inherently reject what it has to say, right? So, yeah, I think that there has been absolutely an effort among some practitioners, like especially I think among Buddhists, there have been a lot of efforts to like demonstrate effects by means of brain scans. But I find that to be kind of a trivial pursuit, personally. As somebody who does some of this stuff, I think it's exactly falling into the trap of representation over performance, because those brain scan pictures and the diegesis of what they mean, like the explanation of what they mean, may convince some scientist somewhere that something is happening, but it is utterly worthless as a guide to performance, which is really what you care about. Like, you do these things to do these things. You don't do them to like prove to some brain scientist that you're just a great person. Like, what are you doing if that's your deal, right? So, like, you know, generally speaking, that's why most of the writing about this stuff is the procedure, right? Like, how do you do it? But even then, it's like you don't just sit down and do it. So, like, I think in this chapter they have like a reproduction of like a yantra, right? Like, it's, you know, a small diagram used in sort of tantric meditation to focus the mind and to put it into a certain state. But, like, you know, I'm looking at this yantra right now and it doesn't do anything for me. It's just like it's a triangle and a triangle inside a circle. Like, okay, that's great. Like, so it's not like taking it's not like taking Prozac or something, right? Like it's not like you can have this very clearly defined cause effect relationship. And I mean, even then there's issues of like what the pharmaceutical company says it does versus what it actually does. Yeah. But generally speaking, modern like Western science that deals with the body is looking for clear causes leading to clear demonstrable effects. And you certainly don't get that with a yantra. Like, you just look at the yantra and it's like, okay, that's just a picture. That doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't do anything special. But yeah, like, if you practice this stuff a long time, you put a lot of work and intention into it, it can have effects. And I think that those effects actually do shed a lot of light on what Stafford Beer was doing with things like the VSM. I think there's a lot of insights that come from that into the VSM and help to clarify what the VSM is about. We talked a lot about like the level 1 stuff in the VSM and how that sort of represents like the extremities of the body and the internal organs, right? Like, these are the sort of like base level sensory organs. And one thing that I noticed in doing yoga was like one of the first effects I noticed was that I came into yoga in a state of being like, just really dysfunctional. My body was just a complete mess, and I went there out of I went to start studying out of desperation because I had chronic headaches that were brought on by muscle tension. And when I first started to do yoga, it was like, oh, this hurts so much. It's like, but it's not the yoga that hurts. Your body, it's like the extremities of your body, so like the level 1 of your body is already sending out pain signals to your brain, right? Like, oh, like everything is fucked, we need to do something, right? Like that kind of signal is already going to your brain. It's just that your muscles become so tense and your body becomes so rigid that the information that is coming to your brain gets blocked off, right? And so it is only when you start to relax your body that information does start to reach your brain, and you do become conscious of the pain that your body is feeling, right? So that's like a very obvious thing that you can link to Beer's organizational thinking, right? Like this idea of asymmetry, that the brain is sending out orders to the body to do things, but not paying any attention to what the extremities of the body and the internal organs, or basically the lower levels of the organization, are sending back up to the command structure. So I think that is a pretty clear one that you can see there. But another thing that you could maybe point to is this idea of each level of the VSM recursively having its own intelligence. I think that is a thing that you also become aware of the more that you do this sort of thing. Like, I remember listening to a guy on YouTube who was talking about martial arts, and he was saying that like most people in the world today are profoundly kinesthetically stupid, right? Like, we have a lot of representational knowledge and we've been trained into a certain mode of thinking and being, but that we've also been trained into a kind of stupidity because we don't understand how to move and use and manipulate our bodies in any meaningful way. Yeah. Like, we're just very sort of like stumbling around, like we're all tense. We just ignore when our stomachs are upset, like whatever, like when all of our internal organs are all like completely messed up, we just try to ignore whatever they are and just like shove down as many pharmaceuticals as possible into our body to keep ours functioning so we can keep thinking, right? Because that's what our jobs are. That's what we've been trained to do for all our lives. But if you do actually go beyond like that sort of basic level of this practice, like yoga, where a lot of people go to yoga to get stronger or to get more fit or to relieve stress. If you go beyond that level, or any kind of physical practice, you go beyond that level, you start to become aware that actually the external organs, the external parts of your body and your internal organs, they are sending meaningful information to your brain. Like you do actually get a more sort of like elevated level of consciousness of what the internal state of your body is and what it is trying to tell you. And that's like, you know, if you look at an Olympic athlete, the reason why they're able to do all of these amazing things is because they have a very intelligent kinesthetic sense. And that gets to this idea of like the level 1 of the VSM actually being within itself its own intelligence.
Yeah, that's cool, because it's that kind of like consciousness raising or like kind of recursive consciousness doesn't need to be a mystical thing. It's just a fact of your body, right? Like your hand is intelligent in its own handiness.
Yeah,
you know, it's not
that's right. Yeah,
it's not a mystical thing at all. It's just like, no, it's self, like, or your heart keeps doing its thing regardless of whether you're paying attention to it or not. Like that's smart.
Yes, it does. It tries to do its best, but like you know, like if say the like level 2 of the VSM is not functioning properly, then you know it's not coordinating level 1 properly, and it's the same thing. If your spinal column is highly compressed, then it's going to compromise the functioning of your autonomic system, right? Like it's a really clear analogy that he is making between the body and between the social organism, the organizational system. So it's I think that's all really, really interesting. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that if you really work at it a lot, you can get these kind of like, you know, sort of consciousness expanding experiences beyond just the level of like, oh, I can see better because, you know, the muscles around my eyes aren't constantly overstressed, or, you know, I can smell better because my sinuses aren't closed up because I don't have muscle tension all the way up my neck. Like all that kind of stuff you can get at a fairly low level. But if you go beyond that, you can start to get more sort of like clarity of thinking. And then even beyond that, it's like your body can start to adjust its homeostatic baseline so that the way you normally feel, like just every day, like what the sensation of your just being in your body that you experience does start to change. And sometimes if it can change quite dramatically within even just like one session. It's very rare that it happens. It's very difficult to achieve, but you can do it. And that is very like upsetting and disturbing because like your whole sense of self is shook up because it's like your baseline is moved. It's like going back to Blade Runner. It's like you've failed your baseline test, right? Like,
well, like you're not you anymore, right? Like because like me right now is the guy whose fucking right shoulder constantly aches, right? Like that is me. Right?
Yeah, if that is a part of being Shane,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. If that stopped happening, I'd be fucking screwed. You know?
Yeah. Especially if it happens suddenly, you're like, well, what is this? And like your body will try to revert back to that old baseline because that's just that is the established sort of like point of gravity that you live your life around. I have the same thing with like, you know, like, oh, my back's messed up and my stomach organs are all squished up and it feels bad, but that's just normally what it's like to be Kyle. So when that does change, that is quite a shock. You know, you can kind of see that as like a thing that Beer sort of appreciated, in the way that he was really quite pessimistic at times about how effective interventions using the VSM model really could be, because there just are these patterns and sort of baselines that organizations establish, and moving those is very, very difficult. And you can absolutely go from there to, say, the problem of revolution, right? Where you actually are moving the social baseline, and it is enormously disturbing and upsetting to a lot of people, just because the established patterns of being are moved. So nevertheless, if you want to actually have that kind of ideal functioning of the system that he describes in the VSM, you kind of have to get there. It's very hard work. The performance is hard work. Like the abstract picture is like, okay, well, yeah, I can listen to this podcast and take a look at the picture and kind of get the idea, but go out and do it, and it's like, okay, this is a lifelong project, right? Like, this is a big deal. So I think that as far as that whole performative and sort of somatic angle goes, all of this tantric stuff really does shed light on what Beer was doing. And my sort of final thought on that was like, to the extent that cybernetics is a practice concerned with achieving harmony and deeply interested in diagramming, right? Like, we have all these diagrams, these circuit diagrams, the VSM diagram, consciousness and alterity, like both like dealing with others, right? Like, that's a big part of cybernetics, is like negotiating this ontological system, and also like altered states, right? Like, that is also a really big part of cybernetics that we've seen. We could perhaps refer to it as a form of social tantra. So that sounds like really weird, right? It sounds like a big orgy or something to most people, I think. But really what it's about is like sort of elevating these levels of consciousness and achieving more sort of like harmony between different parts of the social organism. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, and definitely falls into that tantric category as well, by being sort of like this weird social outsider thing, because tantra has always been a sort of outsider practice, even in India.
Interesting, yeah, definitely. I think I like that notion of like social tantra, like raising the consciousness of the whole society. It seems almost a shame to kind of like follow that up with like the actual conclusion of the chapter, which is a quick detour to Brian Eno, who is an artist I respect immensely, but basically that like his the point here is that his experiments with kind of generative music and like setting up rules for musical systems and then letting them play out and then recording the output and stuff is basically influenced by Stafford Beer and cybernetics.
Mm-hmm, yes, which is interesting. Like, he made that leap from reading, sort of organizational literature to creating a new system of musical production. Yeah, and like it's weird that like this because like I kind of come from a like music production background, but this is all the standard advice now, right? Basically, that to use sort of generative techniques, or to use kind of novel things, or to like set up kind of unstable systems and let them let the system express itself and just tape the output. That sort of stuff is all sort of normal technique now. But yeah, this is where the origins come from cybernetics, which is I didn't know. Well, I knew that it originated with Brian Eno, really, that like, or he was at least one of the sort of pioneers of this kind of experimental musical form. But I hadn't known that it was from cybernetics. No. Yeah, no, I didn't know that either until I read this book that was like, oh, really? And like, also like, what was it, like Beer sort of like tried to get Eno to become like his disciple, like his successor or something, and then it's just like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He had him like he had him over for dinner or something and was like, oh, we just really want to pass the torch to you, and he's just like, nah, I don't. I'm more of a music guy, and just sort of, like I would have to change my career completely. Like, how would I do that?
He just wasn't ready, But he still went on to change the world of music. So hey, that's something.
Yeah, I suppose it's a consolation prize. No, I have great respect for I just find it's such an unusual bit of this book, like it's
and I think it's just probably like like Pickering probably likes Brian Eno, and then also just like it's that example of boundary hopping, like one discipline to another, that's sort of like protean character of cybernetics.
And sort of speaking of its protean character, it kind of brings us on to the last chapter, which is Sketches of Another Future. in which Pickering kind of like just basically kind of goes over the themes of because like the structure of the book has been about like individual personalities and the sort of individual projects, but now he's going to restate the themes of the whole history. He also says that like alternatively he could have arranged the book thematically, but that would actually be a completely legitimate way of doing this. And like unsurprisingly, he starts out with ontology that like and actually another working title for the book was simply the word performance. And that's just the centrality of performance in this thing, that like in this schema, like performance is the star around which all the other objects orbit. Like it is the sun at the center of the solar system. And representation and knowledge and such are only ever really pale shadows of performance, or are like in service to performance. And this is what cybernetics is about. It's about systems that do their performance and do their dance of agency, which is good. This is a sort of necessary antidote to the sort of modern scientific perspective of like foregrounding knowledge at the expense of performance. Yeah, and like the other sort of the really big sort of one is power, right? Like the big theme that like. Again, he eventually manages to get back to this like critique of cybernetics as a science of control, but what he does is he breaks down the word control into like, well, it often means command, which is asymmetric and in framing and presumes a knowability in the world. But like what the cyberneticians actually mean by control is influence, which is symmetrical and revealing and unknowable, like it presumes unknowability in the world. And that's crucial, right? Because it's far too easy to dismiss cybernetics as that kind of austere science of command, right? Like, and it just sort of isn't. In fact, quite the opposite,
Right. Again, I mean, there's that whole history of like how did cybernetics develop within the Pentagon that could fit into that picture. But this is a different story about cybernetics. This is the story about performance, right?
And also about like it's actually like it's more evident in the kind of chapters on psychiatry, but like it's about the selves and the human subject, and in particular the kind of like in the same way that we've got a split between a modern and a non-modern ontology, we also have this split between a modern and non-modern self, where like the modern self is this like I think the phrase he uses is a bounded locus of agency, and it's all like representation and calculation and will. Whereas the non-modern self, the sort of self that is explored in Beer's tantric practice, is a complex system of performance and open-ended possibilities and emergence, which is like preferable, I think. It's like
I mean, it was really it's really interesting in this concluding part where Pickering sort of says, like, as much as he was sort of dragged kicking and screaming into studying brain science for this project, he was also kind of dragged kicking and screaming into thinking about spirituality, because that was just something that he considered to be largely meaningless based on his experiences growing up with the Church of England. And so he had to sort of confront this stuff in reading Beer. And it was really interesting when, I actually got to see Pickering talk about this book at Kyoto University some years ago. He came to visit, and most of the audience were members of the History and Philosophy of Science program, and Pickering was sort of like, let's talk about science stuff, but like also like what do you guys think about like this whole Zen thing that Stafford Beer was talking about, and like. Everybody there was sort of like, I don't know, I don't know, like whatever, why would I know anything about that? Because people are here in Japan are largely also modern selves, right? Like especially if you're in a philosophy of science program, right? Like it is still very much the same kind of subjectivity that's developed here. So it is a thing that has become somewhat detached from the East, quote unquote, right? Like a lot of these practices that originate in the East are often, pursued elsewhere in the world now. Like this is a very different world than 200 years ago. But it was definitely really interesting to to see sort of Pickering's perplexity and kind of like confusion over this stuff, and then just like this sort of miscommunication across cultures where it's like, well, in the East they must know about this, so it's like, well, no, not really. Some people do, but not everybody.
That's that is funny. But yeah, so like that's the spirituality bit, which is another big sort of theme throughout all this. Like that, and even for the other cyberneticians, just sort of like an unexpected crossover between those kind of realms. But the other sort of major theme has been the social basis, or even just the sort of lack thereof, of like cybernetics is this like marginal and nomadic practice that didn't have and was also sort of not compatible with institutional support in many ways.
Yeah, we saw that all through the beer story, to the point that the U.S. government and the Chilean military had to overthrow Project Cybersyn. Right, it's
the ultimate sort of vote of no confidence or whatever, or like lack of support.
When the fascist thugs come to kill you, you know that you've had some institutional rejection. But I mean, again, it really felt like that whole story was interesting to me because it really just sort of syncs up with my life experience of what I've been doing, and then also just like this podcast in general, right?
Oh yeah,
it is a thing that exists outside of any kind of given discipline, and also we don't get any institutional support. We just get the support from our patrons, much appreciated.
Very much.
And we just kind of go from one thing to the next, and this all kind of really started out because of a chance encounter, just like all the stories that you find in this book, right? Like it was very much that.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I think our credentials are solid as cybernetic Marxists in this regard.
Yeah, exactly. We're sufficiently like social outsider weirdos to get that title there, I guess.
Oh fuck! It is it's definitely true of us, and like I don't know, it's like it's so strange that this is so consistent throughout this the field of cybernetics, right? That like. And we had a brief glimpse of a possibility of an alternate history in which, I don't know, like we could have had an office for cybernetics in the sort of British government, but no, unfortunately, we don't get to live in that world. So here we are.
And I remember Pickering sort of saying, like, yeah, it's kind of interesting that stuff did get institutionalized in the Soviet Union, but it's really not the same sort of, like, they weren't doing the same sort of stuff that he's talking about in this book, right? Because that was kind of the first thing I asked him when we were at the presentation there. Is like, oh, well, what do you think about like Soviet cybernetics? He's like, well, yeah, it's interesting, but it's kind of a different sort of practice than what is dealt with in this book in particular.
And the sort of last sort of section really closes out with that these are sort of sketches for another future. And the necessity of this is, and I think we've gone over it, but like modernity is kind of like has quite a few blind spots, and that are kind of really hampering us at this point. And we're not talking about destroying modernity or anything like that, but simply breaking its hegemonic sort of grip and allowing for alternatives, so that when you approach a problem, it should be possible to choose whether to approach it from a non-modern or a modern standpoint, or whatever, a multiplicity of possible sort of approaches. Because there are legitimate uses of modernity. Like you're sort of like, if I get in the elevator, I kind of want it to predictably go to the right floor, right? And like I want that absolute control to be there,
Yeah, exactly. So that it is a very difficult negotiation to make, right? And I think like any of us who who are influenced by this kind of thinking that you find in this book. We have to make that negotiation all the time in our lives, but it is. Yeah, it's very difficult to think through and to change the structures of our society in a way that could be more adaptive, but nevertheless give us a certain amount of basic reliability and security.
Yeah, but Pickering sort of like closes out by suggesting that a way to start this would be to basically teach unknowability in schools and to essentially have kids play with cybernetic artifacts. The robot tortoises and homeostats and various systems, and kind of get this sort of non-modern ontology and this ontology of performance into kids' heads at a pretty young age is maybe the best way to restructure society.
Yeah, I think it could definitely help, and I'm a teacher. This definitely resonated for me. It's the thing I've thought about a lot, and like. One class I do get to teach is like a game design class, and I think a lot about how to structure lessons and like how to teach this stuff, because I am trying to teach these kinds of open-ended cybernetic systems, right? That is sort of a characteristic of play, or at least interesting play, that you are. Especially in a tabletop RPG, you're not bounded by the limitations of animations and digital assets, right? Like you just have to continue the conversation. So I really try to promote that sort of thinking. And like one thing I did last week that I can sort of speak to is like, well, I had the class. Write up like the basics of like just the basic premises of a adventure situation for an RPG, right? They're just like, what is happening, who is there, what is to be found on this thing, what kinds of special situations might you want to see in it, and like as sort of like middling commitment students are wont to do, they just sort of like phoned it in, right, the first week. But I was like, okay, so like, okay, this is your assignment, all right, like they just like put it up on the projector and then just like started to run them through it with everybody else in the class, and like just give the feedback, right? Like, like, okay, well, you wrote this thing. What are the problems with it? Like, how does it feel to actually use this thing, right? Like, instead of just like, here is the assignment, these are the requirements, fill out the requirements and submit it. What does it feel like if you actually use this thing in practice? Like, as a performance, what does that look like? And then you can see in their heads that it's like, oh, actually, there are a bunch of problems here that I never really thought about or bothered to think about. Right. And maybe I should make something good instead of just something that fulfills the basic requirements. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of education, definitely is good stuff.
Yeah, cool. And that's the book. It's. Well, I mean, that's 4 chapters out of it, but it's a sizable chunk of the book.
We may come back to it in a subsequent episode with some of the chapters that we didn't cover.
I think maybe the stuff on Bateson and Lang and maybe Pask might be good ones to do.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of sort of interesting stuff about like social control and design, so that could be interesting for sure.
That could be a fun one to do later, yeah. But no, I think this is definitely recommended reading. It's also like, or even just the beer chapter. Like, I mean, it's like we've skipped over a lot of detail and a lot of stuff that's actually kind of worth knowing. So definitely a recommendation to check it out.
Yeah, and it's a huge book, but it is one that you can just sort of slowly work your way through and enjoy. And there are a lot of little like discrete stories in there, so it's not like you're going to get lost.
Oh yeah, like each of the chapters, especially the ones on like focusing on a personality, is essentially just self-contained. Like they make reference to each other. Like Ashby comes up constantly in all the other chapters, but like you get away with it not really having read his particular chapter. So that's all fine. No, this has been fantastic fun. Really, really good pair of episodes. And it's it's nice to finally get back to the cybernetic stuff.
Right, absolutely.
I think we should maybe try and track down some contemporary cybernetics and see if there's any good stuff floating around out there.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much stuff out there that is cybernetics by another name, right?
Right, like complexity theory and all this sort of stuff, right? Yeah, we'll scout around and see. But yeah, like, thanks, listeners, for coming along with us on this one. If you've been enjoying the show, maybe think about heading on over to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and throwing us a couple of bucks a month to, pay for giant books and, basic sort of maintenance of of ourselves. Otherwise, like, you can find us on Twitter at GI Unit Pod, and we're on Facebook. If you just search for General Intellect Unit, you'll find us. And probably the best way you can help us out is just, like, share the episodes with friends or people you know might be interested in the topics, because like bigger audience is always good. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye.
Goodbye.